Welcome to our textual analysis workshop. We're going to look into a little bit more detail into the prologue of Shakespeare's Henry V. It begins this way. Over a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. These words are for the opening of this play. The speaker is just identified as chorus. He's a member of the company putting on the play that you're about to watch. And Shakespeare's audience would have known what a muse was, and they would have known that Henry the king spent his youth fritting away and not being very respectful, putting his enemies off guard, so that when he did ascend to the throne, he surprised them because they were underestimating him. He won an impossible battle against the French, which were sort of generational enemies of the English. Not only did he defeat them, but he also married the French princess and united the two warring kingdoms, putting an end to what was known as the 100 Years' War. Now, of course, that sort of fairy tale version of history was an exaggeration. It was a bit fanciful, but the point is, Shakespeare could count on his audience to know a lot of details, general details about Henry's life, and the audience would have enjoyed figuring out how Shakespeare fulfilled or worked around certain details and how he diverged from the general narrative and how he made it his own. That would have been part of the fun. So, the speaker in this opening text is calling attention to the weaknesses of the theater. You can't put a whole kingdom on the stage. The audience knows they're looking at actors, not at the real historical figures. Now, a little bit later in this speech, we have these lines. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden ode the very casks that did affright the air at Agincourt? Well, you know what a cockpit is, right? But hold on. Yeah, it's the thing a pilot sits in, but this was centuries before the airplane was invented. So to Shakespeare's audience, a cockpit was literally a pit in which roosters tried to peck each other to death. And people watched and bet on them and drank and fought and, had a great time. So that's what a cockpit would have been to Shakespeare's audience. And the wooden O, well, theater in Shakespeare's day was kind of like a small stadium. It was open to the sky in the center, and so it looked like an O was made out of wood. Now, people went to the theater during daytime when it was light, so the light would come in through that big sky opening. And you'd pay a penny to enter and stand in the yard, where I guess you hoped it didn't rain. If you wanted to sit in the benches, you'd pay for another penny to sit up higher, and if you were rich, you could rent a box in the upper levels. There was no front curtain, there were no spotlights, there were no colored backdrops. Now, there was a trapdoor in the stage, and above the stage there was this mechanism, a pulley, that could, pull a platform up and down, and, gods could descend and do things. So, but to make sense of this speech, you really have to imagine an actor standing alone in front of a pretty bare stage. They didn't have many props. They didn't have colored backdrops and so forth in Shakespeare's days. And this actor is pointing at this environment, letting people know, hey guys, this is fake. Reminding the audience there's no way that we, who are just a bunch of actors, can do justice to this awesome story that you came to hear us tell you. Well, this word casks, what does that mean? I happen to know this word, but the only reason I know it is because I've read this play before and I looked it up once. A cask is just a helmet. In Google Docs, you can right-click on a word, and one of the options is to define it. You do that, you'll see a definition that it means helmet. Now, I'm guessing, maybe from the spelling, it looks kind of French to me, that maybe a casque is a particular kind of French helmet. I looked it up online, and what I saw was a bunch of headphones that have the Casque brand name and some bike helmets. So I really don't know that much about armor. But at any rate, we can gather that cramming a lot of these particular casques, these helmets, into this wooden O is as unlikely a thing as fitting the vasty fields of France into a cockpit. Okay, to affright the air. What does that mean? Okay, well, if I were delivering the lines, I could just say that did affright the air at Agincourt. But if I were to say that did affright the air at Agincourt, Okay, that's a little extra. Okay, don't do that. But my point is, Shakespeare's audience probably would have recognized the name Agincourt as the locale, the site of Henry's great victory against the French. And so a little later, the speech goes on like this. Suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined two mighty monarchies. Okay, well, he's asking us to imagine, but here's some words that you don't hear every day. Girdle, it's a garment that you wear around your waist. Okay, got that. Upreared, abutting, perilous, asunder. You don't really encounter upreared that often, but it means to, something that is rearing up. A horse rears up. That makes sense. Abutting in real estate. An abutment is something that joins something else. And in carpentry, there's a butt joint that's just joining, it's like sticking things against each other. So to abut is to adjoin, to sort of be next to. But it's not like being next to each other cozily like peas in a pod. It's more like this upreared and abutting fronts. It's, that they're up next to each other, but they're in each other's face. They're aggressively approaching each other. So these two mighty monarchies, confined within this garment like a girdle, tightly bound in there, these two monarchies are in each other's face, and they are parted asunder by the perilous narrow ocean. Perilous, peril, form of danger. Asunder, have you heard, what God has joined, let no man put asunder? Separate, in separate pieces. So we're being asked to imagine all this is happening here. These two aggressive, in-your-face monarchies, narrowly divided by a dangerous ocean, are tightly confounded within this building that's like a girdle. Now, this chorus has just given us a list of ways that this play cannot possibly do justice to this fantastic and amazing and epic story. But there's like a secret plan going on here. The chorus says, "Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts." It's not peace out like, hey, peace out. Peace out. What does it mean to peace out? Well, you could look it up, but let's go a little bit further in the speech, and I think you'll be able to figure out what the chorus means by piecing out imperfections. Think when we talk of horses, that you see them printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth. This stage is actually pretty small. There's not room for you to bring a bunch of horses out there. Now, Shakespeare's audience probably would have known that one of the reasons why Henry defeated the French at Agincourt was because the British were using crossbows, which were stronger than regular, bows and arrows, and were able to penetrate the heavy armor of the mounted French cavalry, so that the English were able to kill the cavalry from a distance before the horses ever got close enough for the French soldiers to, poke you with your staff. So the horses are a huge part of why Henry was able to defeat the French. And you're not really doing the French justice unless you represent them on their horses. And you're not doing you're not doing the British justice by showing them how they were able to defeat such an awesome enemy. So all Shakespeare can do is have his characters talk about horses. And we, when we hear Shakespeare's characters talk about horses, are asked by the chorus to imagine them. There's such a specific image, printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth. Now, to make that point in a movie, you'd do a close-up. You'd zoom in a slow motion. You see the horse printing its hoof in the mud. Shakespeare's medium doesn't do close-ups. It doesn't do, wide-angle shots. It doesn't do any of these flashbacks. It doesn't do things that jump cuts, fade to black. These are things that you and I just, we just know these things. Shakespeare's audience didn't think in those terms. Shakespeare's stories don't require that kind of storytelling, and in fact, those kinds of details, I think, would detract from the power of Shakespeare's art, which is in the words. And those words enact and bring about and depend upon a whole different set of conventions, some of which we're still very familiar with, but many of which have fallen out of favor because they're not as important for the media that are deeply important to our lives. So, and Shakespeare and his audience knew those conventions as strongly and as well as you and I know exactly what's happening when we hear harp music and the screen goes blurry. We know that a flashback is coming. Shakespeare depended mostly on the spoken word for his effects. And we'll learn to spot some of those effects as we work through the plays for the rest of the semester. Okay, so 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings, carry them here and there, jumping o'er times, turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass. Deck our king. So deck the halls with boughs of holly, or maybe somebody is really dressed up, you say they're all decked out. So that's where deck comes from. Turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass. Well, the chorus has asked us to recognize that I'm going to be jumping around in time and I'm going to compress things. Now, this is something really interesting. The chorus has just talked about horses and said, when we talk about horses, I want you to imagine them. And then a couple lines later, the chorus talks about your thoughts will be carrying our kings and helping them jump over times. Shakespeare doesn't come right out and say, because we can't put horses on the stage, hey buddy, your thoughts are our horses. He never actually comes out there and says that. He says, when we talk about horses, I want you to imagine them. And then knowing that we're imagining them, because if I say, imagine a pink elephant, you're going to think of a pink elephant. But knowing that we're thinking of horses that time, he starts using other horse-related imagery. And our thoughts become active. Our thoughts are part of this grand adventure. And this is one of Shakespeare's great skills. He didn't come right out and say, your thoughts are our horses. But all the pieces are there for us to put together. Now, I didn't quote this earlier, but in an earlier part of this passage, the chorus invokes your imaginary forces. That is, the powers of imagination. Shakespeare's audience would have known that it's traditional for poets to call upon a muse to help the poet do justice to the story they're about to tell. But here, in this speech, instead of calling on a muse, the chorus is admitting, I don't have a muse. Oh, for a muse of fire that can do all these things. The chorus says, I don't have a muse who can do these things. What he does have is the audience's imagination. Now, just as an earlier section very cleverly drafts our imagination to take on the part of the absent horses, Shakespeare is here drafting the audience to take on the part of the muse. He wants the audience to help him tell the story. Without the audience actively participating and working like a horse, this audience isn't going to, or the show is not going to happen. The story's not going to happen. So on that note, I want to wrap things up. I really only went over part of this speech. I'll actually ask you to read the whole thing and go over it in more detail, and I have an audio recording of me delivering the whole speech that we'll talk about. That's coming up. But for now, I just want to ask you, what do you think of the class so far? What have you learned? What's new? What's different? What are you looking forward to? What are you worried about? Canvas has some details about how I'd like you to respond to this video. But just in general, there's no right or wrong answer. There's no secret correct answer in the back of my book that I'm going to ask you to spit back on a multiple choice quiz. If this were an in-class situation, I would finish it by, sitting down at the edge of my table very casually and just saying, okay, guys, tell me what you think. we can't do that electronically, at least not easily. You guys have to work and, and respond and upload your things individually, and you'll have to then take the effort to respond to what your classmates have to say. And as the class unfolds, I'll kind of try to bring you around to doing that at the level that I really think will be useful and helpful for a class like this. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this taste of a textual analysis, kind of walking you through how we can take a text that might at first seem impenetrable, but if we get the words right by looking up unfamiliar words, and if we get a sense of what the context of those words would have meant to Shakespeare's original audiences, then we can start putting those pieces together and making sense of Shakespeare and his context. And I hope this has been a good step as you take your journey towards understanding and appreciating Shakespeare in context.